A man walks into a convenience store, pulls out a gun, and robs the cashier. He is caught, tried, convicted, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The judge calls it justice. The jury calls it proportionate. The newspaper calls it closure. Sapolsky calls it a category error, roughly equivalent to imprisoning a diabetic for having low insulin. This is not a comfortable comparison, and Sapolsky knows it. He has spent decades at Stanford studying the biology of human behavior, and if there is one conclusion that runs like a spine through all of his work, through his research on baboons in Kenya, through his landmark book Behave, through his more recent Determined, it is this: by the time a person does anything, the biological wheels that produce that action were set in motion long before the person had any conscious awareness of what was coming. To blame someone for their behavior, Sapolsky argues, is to fundamentally misunderstand what behavior is. The brain is not a courtroom. To understand why Sapolsky finds the concept of punishment so scientifically troubling, you first have to understand how he thinks about the brain, which is to say, you have to understand that he refuses to think about it in isolation. Most people, when they think about a decision, imagine something like a deliberating self, a little homunculus sitting behind the eyes, weighing options, choosing freely. Sapolsky dismantles this image piece by piece. What actually happens when a person does something, he explains, is a cascade of biological events that begins not a moment before the action, not an hour before, but years, decades, sometimes generations before. Consider what is happening in the brain in the seconds before a violent act. The amygdala, that ancient almond-shaped structure buried deep in the temporal lobe, is firing. It is the brain's threat detection system, its alarm bell, its hair trigger. When the amygdala activates, it sends distress signals cascading through the nervous system. Heart rate climbs. Muscles tense. The body prepares for fight or flight. Meanwhile, the frontal cortex, the most recently evolved part of the human brain, the seat of impulse control, long-term thinking, and moral reasoning, is trying to pump the brakes. The frontal cortex is essentially the brain's adult in the room, the part that says, wait, think about this, consider the consequences. In a healthy, well-resourced, non-threatened individual, the frontal cortex usually wins. But here is the critical thing Sapolsky wants you to understand. The frontal cortex does not operate in a vacuum. Its ability to regulate the amygdala is profoundly shaped by factors that have nothing to do with the individual's choices in that moment. How much sleep did they get the night before? Frontal function drops measurably with sleep deprivation. What is their glucose level? Low blood sugar impairs prefrontal regulation. Have they experienced chronic stress? Sustained stress literally remodels the brain, shrinking the prefrontal cortex and expanding the amygdala, making people more reactive and less capable of restraint. Did they grow up in poverty, in a household full of chaos and threat? Childhood adversity alters the architecture of the developing brain in ways that persist for decades. By the time the person commits the act you are about to punish them for, Sapolsky argues, their brain has already been shaped by forces entirely outside their control. To punish the act while ignoring those forces is, in his view, not justice. It is theater. The seductive logic of blame Sapolsky is not naive about why blame is so appealing. He understands the psychology of it deeply, and he explains it with the same biological framework he applies to everything else. Blame, he points out, is a deeply social and deeply ancient instinct. Humans are intensely hierarchical, tribal animals. We evolved in small groups where the enforcement of norms was essential to group survival. When someone violated a norm, stole food, cheated, attacked a member of the group, there was an immediate and powerful social need to identify that person, signal their transgression, and restore the group's sense of order. Blame and punishment were not just practical tools. They were rituals of social cohesion. This is why punishment feels so right. The satisfaction people experience when a wrongdoer is punished is not a rational calculation. It is a visceral emotional response that lights up the brain's reward circuitry. Studies using neuroimaging have shown that watching someone you perceive as deserving get punished activates the same dopaminergic pathways involved in eating, sex, and other primary rewards. We are, in a very literal neurological sense, built to enjoy punishment. But Sapolsky is careful to point out that the fact that something feels right tells you nothing about whether it is right. Evolution optimized us for survival and reproduction in small tribal bands on the African savanna. It did not optimize us for moral accuracy. The feeling of justified blame is a social and biological artifact, not a guide to truth. What the neuroscience of violence actually shows. When Sapolsky walks through the research on violent criminals, the people most likely to receive the harshest punishments, what emerges is not a portrait of freely choosing evil agents. It is a portrait of damaged biology. Study after study shows that people convicted of serious violent crimes are disproportionately likely to have histories of severe childhood trauma and abuse. They are more likely to have been exposed to lead and other environmental neurotoxins during critical periods of brain development. They are more likely to have frontal lobe damage from head injuries, from prenatal alcohol exposure, from the neurological wear and tear of chronic poverty and stress. Sapolsky cites the striking statistic that approximately 25% of men on death row in the United States have a documented history of traumatic brain injury to the frontal cortex. He also points to research on the genetics of aggression, not to argue for a simple determinism where genes dictate behavior, but to show how genes interact with environments in ways that nobody chooses. The MAOA gene, sometimes sensationally called the warrior gene in the press, codes for an enzyme that breaks down neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. Certain variants of this gene are associated with increased vulnerability to aggression, but only in people who have also experienced childhood abuse. The gene alone does almost nothing. The environment alone does less than you might expect. But the combination can be devastating, and nobody chose their genes. Nobody chose whether they were abused as a child. This is the kind of multi-layered biological story Sapolsky is always trying to tell. Not genes or environment, not brain or culture, but the endlessly complex interaction between all of these things, none of which the individual controls. The free will problem, at the center of Sapolsky's critique of punishment, is his broader argument about free will, or rather, his argument that it does not exist in any meaningful sense. He is careful here to distinguish between different definitions of free will. There is a weak version, the idea that behavior is not completely random, that people's choices reflect their values and desires, and Sapolsky has no quarrel with this. Of course, behavior reflects internal states. Of course, people differ in what they want and what they do. That is not the issue. The issue is the stronger claim embedded in our legal and moral systems, that at the moment of the act, the person could have done otherwise. That given exactly the same brain, the same history, the same biological state, the same circumstances, they could have chosen differently. This is the version of free will that justifies holding people morally responsible in the deepest sense, the version that makes punishment feel like more than just a practical social tool. And this version, Sapolsky argues, is simply incompatible with what neuroscience and biology have shown us about how behavior is produced. Every decision emerges from a brain. Every brain is the product of genetics, development, experience, and environment. None of those things were chosen by the person whose brain it is. The chain of causation runs backward indefinitely, through childhood, through the womb, through the lives of parents and grandparents, through evolutionary history, and nowhere in that chain does a freely choosing self step in and take the wheel. This is not a new philosophical argument. Determinism has been debated for centuries. What Sapolsky brings to it is the weight of modern neuroscience, the brain scans, the hormone studies, the epigenetics research, the data on how poverty reshapes neural architecture, all of it converging on the same uncomfortable conclusion. So what do we do? The question Sapolsky always faces at this point in the argument is the practical one. If punishment is philosophically incoherent, what do we replace it with? He is clear that abandoning punishment does not mean abandoning the protection of society. Some people are dangerous. Some people will harm others again if given the opportunity. Sapolsky has no objection to incapacitating dangerous individuals, keeping them away from potential victims. What he objects to is the retributive logic that layers on top of this practical necessity, the idea that suffering is what they deserve, the idea that making them suffer constitutes justice. In place of retribution, Sapolsky advocates for a system oriented entirely around understanding and intervention. Why did this person do what they did? What in their biology, their development, their circumstances produced this behavior? What can be changed? For some people, the answer to that last question is very little. The damage is too deep, the risk too high. But even in those cases, Sapolsky argues, the response should be one of tragic necessity rather than righteous punishment. We are not avenging a wrong. We are managing a biological reality. For the broader population of offenders, the majority, whose behavior is shaped by poverty, trauma, addiction, mental illness, neurological damage, the implications are radical. It means investing in early childhood interventions that alter brain development trajectories. It means treating addiction as the neurological disorder it is. It means addressing the structural conditions, inequality, environmental toxins, chronic stress, that systematically impair the frontal cortex development of millions of children before they ever have a chance to make a choice. The hardest part. Sapolsky knows that none of this is emotionally easy. He has said in interviews that the hardest thing about his worldview is not the intellectual challenge of defending it. It is living with the emotional implications. When someone does something monstrous, when a child is hurt, when an act of senseless cruelty lands in the news, every human instinct screams for blame, for punishment, for someone to be held accountable in the deepest possible sense. Sapolsky feels those instincts too. He is not a robot. But he has spent a career studying where those instincts come from and what they actually achieve, and his conclusion is that they lead us badly astray. The goal, he says, is not to eliminate the emotional response. It is to recognize it for what it is, a biological artifact of our evolutionary history, and to build institutions and systems that are governed by understanding rather than by the appetite for retribution. This is in the end what Sapolsky sees as the true moral challenge of our moment. Not to be less outraged by cruelty and injustice, but to be honest enough about biology to channel that outrage into something more than the satisfying but ultimately hollow ritual of making people suffer for what their brains, shaped by forces beyond their control, compelled them to do. The man who robbed the convenience store is still in prison. The judge still calls it justice. But in Sapolsky's classroom, the question hanging in the air is the one that never quite goes away. What if we're wrong about all of this? And what would it cost us, really cost us, to find out?